How precious is your steadfast love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. The promise we're going to look at today is one that I've known almost my whole life, I think. It is a promise that we all should know, and we need to claim this promise regularly. It is a promise that relates to what I talked about in the previous verse, and it relates to the providence of God. That God is the one who oversees the details of our life. Doesn't mean he controls everything, but it does mean God oversees them and he allows certain things to come our way and other things he prevents. And that's just the providential care of God. So we talked about this in Psalm 55, that we are to cast our burden upon the Lord. That's what a burden is one of these things that comes into our life. And what Romans 8:28 is going to remind us of is that God works all things together for good in our life. And so therefore we can trust him. So let's look at our memory verse, do what we normally do, and that is recite it using the opening address or reference and closing with the address or reference. Romans 8:28. Oh, by the way, we're going to memorize it in the New King James Version, and we'll talk about why I like that opposed to others. Okay. So Romans 8:28. And we know that he works all things together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. Actually, I realized that um, I've gotten used to saying this way because I retranslated it. Some translations will say, we know that God works all things together for good. And the use of the word God um, isn't in but just a very, very few manuscripts. So I'll talk about that later, but that's the way I wrote this for us to memorize it. It's not the way it is in the booklet, but this is a good way to say it because it reminds us that God's the one in control. Romans 8:28, and we know that he works all things together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. So this is our 52nd episode. That means that we have been doing this for a year. We've been focusing on these memory verses. And I know some of you have been extremely diligent, and you can go back and recite every one of these memory verses and these promises that God has given us. Others of you, well, maybe you haven't been quite as diligent. So right now, I just want to do a little review of this section that we've covered, this section that is on anxiety and worry, that God is the one who watches over us. And so we ought not give in to anxiety, worry, and fear. These are emotional sins. These are mental attitude sins, sins that have their source in the sin nature in the flesh. So let's just review these. The section begins with 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your cares upon him because he cares for you, that we are to do this through prayer. Isaiah 41:10, fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. Yes, I will uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness. John 14:27, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. John 14:27. Philippians 4:6 and 7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall defend your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:6 and 7. Deuteronomy 31:8. And the Lord, he is the one who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you. Do not fear, nor be dismayed. And last week, Psalm 55:22. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he shall sustain you. He shall never permit the righteous to be moved. And we know that because of Romans 8:28. And we know that he works all things together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. So first of all, I've already alluded to this. We have a little bit of a translation problem. Really, it's not so much a translation problem as a textual problem. And we see this in the difference between Romans 8:28 in the New King James Version and Romans 8:28, excuse me, Romans 8:28 in the New American Standard Version. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God." Now, I want you to notice here the verb is work together, and it uses all things as the subject of working together. Now, I think that's a little bit problematical because the things that's a neuter. They don't have volition and they're not in charge. I've always struggled with that. And that was probably what happened in the early church, that there was a scribe who wanted to clarify exactly what this meant. And so this kind of wording slipped into a few manuscripts. And there are those who think that those very few manuscripts, only one that's of any significance, uh, and it reads, "We know that God causes all things to work together for good." Now, I think that communicates the sense, but the word theos is not in any of these other manuscripts except maybe one or two early ones, and then the four or five other references just probably just reference that one manuscript. So even those who do not believe in a majority text view of textual criticism argue that God should not be in this. So it really doesn't come down to this conflict between the critical text and the majority text, because critical text editors say God shouldn't be there. The evidence for that is extremely, extremely weak. Now, I know some of you don't know anything about textual criticism or anything, but I like to mention that when we do have a significant difference in translation here. However, the verb that is used is a third person singular verb. So it could be that all things, which is a neuter noun, that serves as the subject for the verb, or that he, which is embedded in a third person singular verb, works as well also. So this is why I've come to the place where I think that the best way to translate this and to understand it is that we know that he causes all things to work together for good. It's talking about God's providential care. Whether you take one view or the other, the bottom line is everybody understands that it is God who is in his providence working all things together for good. Now, the other issue has to do with this phrase, to those who love God. Is this a reference to the fact that God only works things together for good to those who are growing and maturing as believers, those who are loving God? Not every believer loves God, even if they say that. We're reminded of passages like John 14:15. Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And in John 14:21, he says, "He who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." Now, some people will go to these passages and say, well, see, these passages indicate that there's a special category believer that's obedient and growing, and those are the ones who love God. There are those who are disobedient and not growing, they don't love God. And so they would say that Romans 8:28 only applies to those who love God. But see, the verse doesn't stop there. It doesn't say he works all things together for good to those who love God, but there's an additional explanatory phrase, to those who are called according to his purpose. So we could look at it this way, that that the second phrase explains the first phrase. That's one way of understanding it. That he works all things together for good to those who love God, that is, to those who are called according to his purpose. So the second phrase just explains the first phrase. But we could also look at it this way, that there are two groups mentioned here: those who love God, that is, the maturing believers, and those who are called according to his purpose. That would relate to all believers. Because as we see in Romans chapter 8, verse 29, Paul goes through this sort of series of things. He says, first of all, those who are called according to his purpose at the end of verse 28. And then he explains that. He says, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined. I'm not going to talk about those things right now. It's a chain. Whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. Verse 30, whom he predestined, those he called, whom he called, these he justified, and whom he justified, these he glorified. Well, what that is saying is the ones who are called according to his purpose in Romans 8:28 are those who believe, and those who are justified, and those who are going to be spending eternity in heaven and are glorified. So no matter how you want to understand it, there's, as the second line gives more information and explains that first phrase, or that there's two groups there: those who love God and also those who are called. But the bottom line is God works all things together for good to everyone who is a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is a fantastic promise for us to memorize. And let's just close it out by reciting it together one more time. Remember to start with the address, Romans 8:28. And we know that he causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So when you encounter difficulty, when there are challenges, when there are disappointments, when there's heartache, when things in life just seem to be absolutely chaotic, especially if we look on a broader picture of what's going on in the world during our time, God is working out a plan. God's in charge. He hasn't lost control. It only appears to us to be chaotic, but God has everything moving to that ultimate goal because he works all things together for good. It does not mean that all things are good, but he works them out so that the end result will be his plan and what is good. So until next time, continue trusting God, praying that God will make you strong in your spirit, strengthening your inner man, and continuing to claim these promises when you encounter the challenges of life.